I'd like to move on now to the next submission, which is an oral presentation from Mr. Turner and Mr. Raman and Mr. Walker, as outlined in CMD 18H2.17 and H2.17A. Go ahead, please.
Mr. President, members of the Commission, CNL staff, CSA staff, and members of the public. My name is William Turner, for the record, and I'm here to give a little bit of a summary of our evaluation of whether CNL is qualified to perform the license activities. Let me check all these little, there we go. Okay, what we were going to do is ask 3 uncomfortable questions, outline some of the problems we identified for our evaluation, and to provide our answers of those questions. It's important to recognize that our evaluation is based on information that is easily accessible to the public. 3 questions. There they are. Should CNL be the license holder? Is CNL qualified? And is CNL's management stable? First question. We have significant issues with the GOCO model itself. And the GOCO model explicitly changes CNL's operations to a series of contracts, 5 to 10 years. CNEA, as a lot of the kinds of conversations so far, tends to be conflated with the company. It's very difficult to assign which one of those entities is responsible. There's a problem with the contract itself. Contracts are limited in scope. They focus on deliverables, time, cost, etc. Contracts cannot address long-term issues simply because they're not long-term. And contractors are executors of a scope and not planners. I'll give you a small little example of that, and that is this focus on the 10-year plan that seems to be out there in the ether. If you look at that, according to the GOCO contract, that particular plan has to be approved by AECL. As such, CNL cannot be in control of its future. And what do you want with respect to a license holder? You need to have a license holder that is in control of its future. Our conclusion, CNL should not be the license holder. Some of the problems associated with the license application as it is now, the license expiry date. And here's some examples. I won't go into them in any detail, but they're in the written submission. Conclusion, we suggest that the expiry date of the renewed license should address the dates in the GOCO contract. Some additional problems. CNL's approach to the regulator. CNL is not proactive with respect to ensuring long-term safety. Here's a couple of things about evidence. There's a statement from Mr. Keeler that was presented at the Old Fort Williams Cottagers Association back in July. There's a link to the media article where this quote is there. And the ultimate ruler of this is the CNSC. Interesting comment, because that suggests that CNL doesn't have to do anything unless the CNSC tells them they need to do it. And also with respect to some of their proposals, typically they do not address what the regulatory and international best practice are before they submit something for review. And we have some examples of that later on. Our conclusion, CNL relies on the CNSC and the public to identify long-term safety issues. So, question, is CNL qualified? We suggest a hindsight fallacy, and I'm assuming that most people know what that means. I'll give you a simple example, and that's tossing a coin. So in 4 tosses of the coin, you get all heads. What's the likelihood of the next toss being a tail or a head? It's still 50-50. It doesn't matter what all the previous ones are. You have to focus on what's the potential in the future. So what focusing on the past means, you're essentially looking at past history. That's heavily influenced by the NRU operations. It's also the safety and control areas, which is, again, another subject that's come up, is for the Chalk River site, again, is focusing on NRU. With NRU shut down, virtually all those SCAs are really not relevant for future operations. So, second question. An evaluation of past performance essentially is, we're saying that it is not, well, it would be good if the organization had a history of a stable management, future activities are not changed very much, and the future is not project-oriented, in other words, short-term. Conclusion, past performance cannot be used to predict future. We suggest a better predictor would be the CNL's current activities associated with the 3 waste disposal facilities. And I recognize that is out of the scope. However, we're not looking at those. We're looking at those as examples of CNL's approach to how it does things. We came up with these 3 criteria, which we'll go into in detail, except for the last one, but that's in the written submission. Our conclusion is the better predictor would be the waste disposal facilities. So let's take one of those particular evaluation criteria, which is compliance with international standards, et cetera, and so on. With the example we pull out is environmental assessment process. This is part of the communications associated with that. And the approach by CNL is what's known as decide, announce, defend. And with respect to that, there has been no attempt by CNL to address public comments on the 3 disposal projects. There's no timely response to any of the public responses. The assessment of the CAA alternative means is flawed. Again, more details is given elsewhere. Conclusion, CNL lacks the appropriate understanding of regulations and guidelines. Lack of open and public engagement. 2 specific statements by CNL's top executive. I'm not going to go into those explicitly. There's also, back in August, approximately a couple of weeks before the end of the comment period on the NSDF, CNL held a open house, and what meaning it had to the whole EA process, I cannot tell you. Incomplete and misleading. This is one of the things that's come off the CNL website. It's a comparison of waste volumes. What relevance this has to actual, their particular proposal, I don't know. There's some things that are missing here, what is the content, radiological content of these things, where they are situated, etc. It's kind of disturbing. So we're suggesting their approach is essentially non-existent. Management stable. Here's a little bit of an overhead showing the differences between the management, and just to point out a few things, and I'm about running out of time. It's the color coding. I know you can't really read it, but if you look at the whites, that is people in a position that haven't changed. And if you count up the number of whites from the that go straight across, you'll see 5. If you look at all the various changes, essentially what's happening in management, there's about a 60% change in the original management in 2 years. Suggests the half-life of an executive at CNL is less than a year. So, the observation, CNL's management conforms or operates as a contractor short-term. We suggest that CNL's management is not stable. Question 1, the answers. Because CNL executes scope, does not provide policy direction, we suggest that it should not be the license holder. Question 2, which is based on 24.4a, we suggest that CNL is not qualified to carry on the activities. Is CNL's management stable? Well, I think you've seen that. Our overall conclusion, we respectfully submit that a decision by the by the Commission to grant the 10-year license to CNL would be unsafe, unsound. Thank you. Any questions?
Oh, I'm sure there are going to be questions. Thank you.
Now,
Who
do I
wants to
have the
start?
answer? Whoops.
Dr. Solomon?
In your submission, this question to the intervener, in your submission, section 5.3, page 13 of 17, you are saying that usually it takes about 3 years for new management of a company to become familiar with the organization business. The 3 years quoted is either an assumption or a fact. If it is a fact, it lacks references. If it is an assumption, it is subject to interpretation. So I would like you to expand on that, if it is an assumption or it is a fact. And I would like also CNL to comment on the organization or management, what the intervener said, instability.
Thank you for the question. Bill Turner for the record. I have to say yes and no. Yes, because I know what it takes me when I get a new job, approximately how long it takes to get familiar with what's going on in the organization, that kind of thing. Also, when I see new employees come in, how long does it take the people to become familiar with what goes on, how things are done, all that kind of stuff. It's part of the transition between corporate memory and then taking that corporate memory into the job and how you fit in. So yes, in terms of personal experience, yes, in terms of what I see around there, and as to whether there's a specific reference to that, there is some information out there, if you kind of look on the social webs and stuff like that, gives that kind of feel. But I don't have an actual specific documented reference. It's, so is it an assumption? It's not an assumption from my experience. It might be an assumption for other people's experience. I can't tell you, but that's essentially, that's where that statement comes from.
I thought you should address the environment of the organization. There is many factors can be as an input, whether it will take 1 year or 2 years or 3 years. So it is the environment of the organization or the company. It is the capability of the manager to acquire all the rules, the size of the organization. There is many factors. So it can take 1 year, it can take 2 years, it can take more or less. And I can see that it is more an assumption than fact.
You want to comment first, and then you can rebut?
Mark Lazinski for the record. Thank you for this opportunity to respond. We talked about this in our opening remarks about some of the changes. I think I kind of hit it head on there, realizing that there were some questions about the fact that we did have some changes to our management. So I think the question I'm addressing is management stability, first off. Before we even arrived at the site, just to point out, before there was a GOCO, in the 10 years preceding, there had been 3 different CEOs and 4 different CNOs, which had occurred before. And actually, as you look at our record, back then, the safety record of the site, it had remained stable throughout that time with those changes. Just as a point of context. But as I mentioned during our opening comments, this is our approach. You come in and you look and see, you have a plan in mind as to what you think the site needs to do, what the client or the government would like to have done with the site. You assess what's happening at the site, both procedurally as well as what's happening with people and behaviors. And then you assess your team that you have, and you ensure that the people that you bring to bear their experience is appropriate for the things that you want to change and affect and improve. And in fact, then we improved. One other thing I wanted to point out too is that the chart that was presented is misleading. It's inaccurate. It points out in green that Kevin Daniels has changed. Kevin's been here. He was here since day 1. Lou Riccoboni has been here since day 1. And in fact, like David Cox was here, but he was not the CNO at the time, but he was operating the reactor. So the consistency is there. There has been some changes, and we're not embarrassed about that. In fact, we're proud of the fact that we're able to be agile and change with the times so that we can address the issues that we have at the site. The other thing I want to point out, too, is that the organization, as we've said, that we are licensing here is CNL. The individuals that were brought on are brought on because they have different and international experience and different ideas in order to bring the site up to standards that are consistent with the rest of the world right now so that we can respond and we can change and we can improve. But the licensability, the stability of the site comes from the 2,800 people that are still there, have been there, are constantly changing. People do come and go. There's a percentage of that. But our stability comes from that and from the people that have been there for decades.
Thank you. Question? Mr. Seeley?
Yeah, I have a question maybe with respect to the CNL is not qualified and not proactive with respect to long-term safety. So those statements, maybe just to ask who was managing the site 2011 and 2012. This was previous to the GO.
Yeah, Mark Lasinski for the record. The question is who was managing the site in 2011 and 2012? AECL was the managing entity at the time, but then all 2,800 people were reporting to AECL. Yeah.
It was managed under AECL.
Correct.
And then in 15, 16, 2015 and 16, it would be CNL under the GO.
That's right. Well, no, yes,
Yeah,
15,
yeah,
16,
yeah.
starting in September of 15.
Okay. So just that clarification is important because if we look to the summary of, for example, safety performance, and we see that in 2011 and 2012, the safety performance was something in the order of 13 lost time injuries in 2011, 21 in 2012, and then in 20, which is under the ACL management, and then in 15 it drops to 2. So there's an example of an improvement in safety performance under the new management and under the new model of a 10-fold increase. And I just don't understand how you can make the statement that they're not committed to long-term safety when you see that significant improvement in safety performance. So and that they're not qualified. So there's one example that I'm just looking at, and it just doesn't compute with what's being stated by the intervener. So perhaps an opportunity to comment, Mr. Turner.
Bill Turner for the record. There's a couple questions going around here. The comment with respect to the business of the 3 years, I think needs to be addressed also. I'm not going to specifically comment on particular individuals in the management. That's not what I'm talking about here, but I can give you one example, or let's say 2 examples that are in that particular table, one of which is the Vice President of Finance. The other one is the Legal Counsel. Those 2 positions changed approximately 1 year after the contract. Now, if this was a corporation external to this, that would be a significant indicator to the shareholder there are issues with what's going on. I can't tell you what those issues would be because that's not part of this. What I've said at the very beginning of this is what's out there in the public. I don't go into investigations, but that's an issue that to me is somewhat significant. This is now essentially a private company. The shareholder happens to be CNEA. At one time, it was ACL. Okay, that's part of the issue with respect to stability of management. That's not technical. Those are not technical positions in a sense of knowing anything about the nuclear industry. Finance is finance, legal is legal. You need probably to have somebody in the legal position that has some idea of what the Nuclear Safety Control Act are and the various guidance and all that kind of stuff. That's critical for that particular role. And I don't have an issue with that. What I have an issue with is within a year or so, whoever was there before left for whatever reason. And that suggests corporate knowledge, which is what I talked about earlier, going from the myself going into a new job and how long it takes to become familiar with what's going on. How does that happen? How do you transfer that knowledge? Now, to the other point with respect to the safety, which is what you raised, Mr. Seeley, the comment, I cannot say anything with respect to those graphs because there's not enough data to demonstrate whether or not 1 year of data doesn't mean a thing with respect to management. You need at least 3, 5, maybe even 10 years of data to show that there is management that is actually functioning. So 1 year of data, anybody who knows anything about how to look at data is a meaningless thing. It could be an anomaly. You have no evidence one way or the other. I don't either. And I won't say that it's good or bad, but there's no basis on which to say that. Now, with respect to ACL's management, okay, yes, there have been senior managers changed, as in the position of president, but the people underneath haven't changed that much, as Mr. Lazinski has said. That suggests strongly to me that management is coming from the bottom up. You don't need these people on the top to tell you what to do. The problem is the people on the top are suggesting this is what CNL will be doing. It's not the guys in the bottom. It's the guys at the top that determine how the place functions. So you're right. All those people are doing the best job they can. And I know quite a few of them because I used to work there. So I don't have an issue with that. I'm talking about the management structure and the stability at the top.
So you basically don't agree with the GOCO model, if I had to boil it down to a bottom line view here. Is that correct?
You are extremely perceptive. Thank you.
Okay, so we don't have to go any further than that. The GOCO model is a government policy. It was agreed to and approved by the government, and that's the model that they are implementing. From our perspective is back to you, A little bit more interesting question is whether the CNL should be the licensee. And you use the example of the budget or the plan, the 10-year plan that is approved by ACL and given to CNL, and therefore I assume then the conclusion is that ACL should be the licensee, if that's what you are saying. I just want to remind you that when ACL was running everything, the 10-year plan would come from NRCan. I don't know if you remember NRCan, since you work there, and they would pass the budget also on an annual basis, and there would be also, so what's the difference?
The difference has to do with what I mentioned earlier on, and that is assigning responsibility. Who is actually responsible for what? One of the issues I have is, my question would be, who actually came up with the 10-year plan? If the 10-year plan was developed by CNL, then what is the role of ACL? My understanding, having attended a couple of sessions by the former chairman of the board, okay, CNL is supposed to do the how. AECL is supposed to do the why. Why are we doing this? They're the ones that control, this is what the government wants, this is why you have to do it. Okay, where does this plan come from? Because this plan is talking about whys. It's not talking about hows. So that's an issue. That's suggesting...
No, but I thought we've dealt with this because I think Dr. Quinn mentioned the fact that ACL is, with the government, developed a 10-year plan, and it was given to CNL to implement. And there's a contractual obligation in there, and in fact, there's a couple of contracts. There's ACL contract with CNL, ACL contract with CNAE. So I think that's the model we discussed, and you obviously don't agree with that model. That's what I'm trying to come down.
No, excuse me. I did not hear anything from ACL saying that they developed the 10-year plan.
Okay, ACL is right there.
Shannon Quinn for the record. Just to be clear on the process around the 10-year plan. So contractually, the obligation is for CNL to develop a 10-year plan and to propose that to AECL. On the ground, what happens is that AECL provides some guidance to CNL in terms of what the high-level priorities of the Government of Canada are, the priorities of AECL, and then it is for CNL to look at those high-level goals and objectives consistent with the priorities of the Government of Canada, and to then, using the depth of expertise that exists within those 2,800 employees in CNL, develop an ambitious yet achievable 10-year plan that will bring value for money for Canada, and to bring to bear their expertise in terms of providing commercial S&T services and understanding where they fit in within the broader nuclear sector, both in Canada and internationally, taking that all into account, set out a comprehensive plan of work. In terms of process, what happens then is of course, as would be appropriate, there is some iteration where it goes back and forth. The views and expertise that exist in both organizations are brought to bear in discussions around that 10-year plan, and then ultimately CNL finalizes what it believes is a 10-year plan that is responsive to the needs of AECL and consistent with the contractual requirements. AECL then has a formal period of review and challenge, and ultimately then that plan is accepted by AECL. But since we're talking about the 10-year plan, I might take a moment to clarify another point of what I think is confusion in the discussion, that the 10-year plan is itself not static. So as we all know, 10 years is a period of time in which things do change, both in the external environment as well as within governments and corporations the size of CNL. And so there is an expectation that that 10-year plan will be updated to remain current and consistent with what is responsive to the external environment as well as the priorities of the Government of Canada.
Can you just elaborate a little bit further the role of the government itself? Because the government is not a bystander to a $7 billion undertaking here. So somewhere along the line, government itself got involved in the long-term view of what needs to be done. So how does that happen?
So it happens in a number of ways, and it is correct to say that, of course, the Government of Canada is not a bystander. Indeed, Natural Resources Canada has responsibility for nuclear policy broadly. And so some of the government's expectations are actually codified in the terms and conditions of the GOCO contracts themselves. But then, sort of to the point around, of course, government sort of priorities do change and evolve over time, as would be appropriate. That influence continues to come in a number of ways. I'll talk to one maybe in particular around nuclear science and technology. So AECL does have a role in bringing together the broad federal interests around nuclear science and technology. So while Natural Resources Canada has responsibility for policy with respect to nuclear science and technology, there are many, many government departments and agencies who have a need for nuclear research, who have experts, who have views on how their organizations' roles and responsibilities need to be served by nuclear research in Canada. And so AECL has a program called the Federal Nuclear Science and Technology Work Plan that brings together 13 different departments and agencies in a formalized governance structure to understand the totality of the needs of the Government of Canada, to understand its broad priorities, not only for nuclear energy research, but also nuclear research that will serve health, safety, security, and the environment. And so that is one formalized mechanism by which AECL understands the broad needs. And then through guidance letters and other more informal mechanisms, communicates that to CNL so that they can look to see that their program of work on the ground is responsive to those needs.
Thank you. Questions? You have the final words.
Okay, I think I have a couple of questions I'd like to put to AECL. Ms. Quinn made some comment about the science and technology work initiative by the government. I don't have the information here, and it's not in the particular submission, because this is a new issue that she has just brought up at the present time. And the question I have for her, because she was at the particular session that I attended and raised questions with respect to that. The session was held by the Board of Directors of AECL back in, I can't remember the date, and Ms. Quinn may be able to give me the date. And there are some overheads from a presentation in which there were 5 of these mission statements or something like that. I can't remember the terminology because, again, I don't have that in front of me. two of those particular initiatives stated explicitly that one of the critical components, requirements, was the operation of NRU. So when she talks about the plan coming from NRCan and putting forward, this is what ACL is going to do, the question I would raise, and I don't have the evidence for that, but if you want it, I can get it for you at some point in time in the future. That was the presentation, that was the question that I raised at that particular session, and I've never really got a good answer to that. So I'm not quite sure who's doing what, but it doesn't sound to me very well organized. The organization, this is the top guy, government saying this, and their ACL is saying this, and CNL is doing something else. Like, where's all that?
Let Dr. Quinn try to reply.
Shannon Quinn for the record. So Mr. Turner is referring to the public meeting that ACL held back on May 9th of 2017. At that meeting, there were a broad range of topics that were covered, and indeed, ACL, together with members of its board and its senior management team, invited questions on any topic that people might be interested in. At that time, there was a discussion around the federal nuclear S&T work plan and its various components. Mr. Turner was referring to the fact that under that program, there are 5 identified what we refer to as theme areas. Those are, again, in the areas of health, safety, security, emergency planning, energy, and the environment. And indeed, Mr. Turner is right to note that in 2 of those theme areas, particularly energy and safety, that the NRU has been identified as being an important facility that can be brought to advantage in doing the work under those theme areas. What was being noted in particular is the fact that because the NRU was already planned to be shut down on March 31st of this calendar year, that the committees and the governance structure associated with the program identified the fact that it would be prudent in the 2 years leading up to that to really focus on getting as much value as possible out of that very important research tool while it remained available to CNL, ACL, and the Government of Canada. And so that's what was really being reflected. The fact that we identify opportunities to use that tool during its remaining life does nothing to suggest that CNL and ACL cannot continue to do productive, meaningful, important, and indeed necessary nuclear research and development to respond to the needs and priorities of the Government of Canada. In fact, the opposite is true. And I think the 10-year plan that CNL put together in response to the guidance provided by ACL, which relies on the input from Natural Resources Canada as that government department responsible for nuclear policy, that actually sets out an exciting and ambitious program of work that I am confident will achieve value for Canada and deliver meaningful results that will inform not only nuclear energy going forward in this country, but also medical applications, improvements to the environment, and will help Canada fulfill its responsibilities in areas of security and non-proliferation.
Thank you. I was remiss. I should have given a chance to Mr. Keller to comment on slide 6, where you explicitly mentioned as the author of this statement. I just want to make sure if you want to have any comments on this or not?
Kurt Keeler, for the record, let me understand the question. That was the quote which was put out. Correct?
Is that I think you give CNSC a lot more power than it deserves, if I had to read it.
And the point of the comment is that in proposing a new project, is that it's incumbent on the licensee to demonstrate that the approach meets all the regulatory requirements and is safe. It is really the CNSC's decision to grant the license, and so within that, in granting the license, they have that authority of whether the proponent has been able to demonstrate they meet the safety requirements to protect the environment and the people and all the regulatory requirements.
So that's good clarification, because if you read this verbatim, it says that CNSC is responsible for long-term safety. I think it's a nuance here, that a shared responsibility. The licensee is the front safety, if you like, operators, and they're the regulator, and I don't think that comes out in that slide.
Yeah, taking one statement out of context of the whole discussion and presentation can sometimes lead to those decisions and assumptions.
Okay, you still have the final word, Mr. Turner.
Thank you. Bill Turner for the record. Okay, with respect to Mr. Keeler's statement, what I'm suggesting with that quotation is the lack of a proactive approach to long-term safety. Because what you should be doing as a proponent, and I think the evidence is in here in with respect to the environmental assessment and the activities associated with the environmental assessment, there has been a lot of comments on the various websites with the environmental assessments that demonstrate explicitly that CNL's approach is not proactive. For example, as people have already talked about, there are IAEA standards with respect to waste management, disposal, etc. There's a lot of them there. And when it comes to those particular facilities that CNL is proposing, it says explicitly in some of these that entombment is not appropriate way forward for disposal of reactors. That has been pointed out several times to CNL through the comment period, and CNL has ignored it. There are other instances which we can come up with if you want. There's lots of them out there. So the comment with respect to what Mr. Keeler has said technically is correct. The CNSC is the ultimate ruler, but that's not the issue. The issue is CNL has to be proactive such that when CNL, if the commission comes to make a decision, hey, it's easy. It's a rubber stamp because they've done all this stuff up front. They've made sure all the regulations are there. They've made sure, for example, that the environmental assessment documentation is out there to the public. There's no changes that happened somewhere between the beginning of the EA process and when the thing is published. The example, again, is the presentation in Quebec. This is 2 or 3 weeks before the end of the review period for a particular document. And how is the public supposed to review a document under the Act when they don't have the appropriate information to review it? That's the issue. It's not whether the CNSC is the ultimate ruler. That betrays a specific way of looking at what the CNSC is all about. And my contention is CNL is not proactive. And this goes back to a question with respect to Mr. Seeley in terms of long-term safety. Unless CNL is proactive in its management, then there is a significant long-term risk to safety at the Chalk River site. It has to be proactive.
Okay, thank you for those comments, and thank you for your presentation.